A warm welcome from Vienna. Very many thanks to the organizers for the invitation to give the keynote at 2025 meeting and convention of the Czechoslovak Genealogical Society this year in Kansas City Overland Park. I'm really sorry for not being able to join you in person, but I hope that nevertheless my lecture, which is based on my research, is of interest for you. Well, let's speak about the Czechs, Slovaks, and Ruthenians who live not only in Bohemia and Moravia, in Galicia, Bukovina, and northern Hungary, but all over Austro-Hungary before 1918 and, of course, during the First World War due to internal migration. And I've brought a map here which shows from 1911 the composition of languages and nationalities within the Habsburg monarchy. But what I always also tell my students when I'm using this map is never believe in any statistics and any maps, because it looks like that there is a huge diversity of languages and nationalities. But on the other hand, it looks like that you see this big red box and you see this blue color. And it looks like on first glance that there in these places only Germans lived or only Czech speakers lived. But this was not true, because the diversity was insofar in a way that goes down to the single village. So sometimes you had a single village in Bohemia and Moravia, where there was half of the speakers Czechs and half of the people German speakers. So never believe in one of these statistics, because it was usually much more mixed. My research topic was the Austro-Hungarian army from 1867 till 1918, because in 1867 there was a common conscription implemented, which meant thousands young men every year had to enlist and to be trained in the Austro-Hungarian army 3 years, which was later reduced to 2 years. What is really important is, and this is what I won't cover today for the lecture, is that the Austro-Hungarian army was not the only army in Austria-Hungary, or the only military. These young men could also have been enlisted into the Honvédség, which was the Hungarian territorial defense, or into the Landwehr, which was its Austrian counterpart. I'm also not dealing with the Navy, which was also made up an own armed force. And I'm also not dealing, because my talk will be based or mostly dealing with the First World War, I'm also not referring to the Czech, Polish, and Ukrainian legions, which have been built up during the First World War. What is really important is that with the common conscription, a new language use or training system was set up for all over Austria-Hungary. So there were more or less no exceptions regarding if someone came from Austria-Hungary or from Bohemia or from Galicia. Every conscript had the right to be trained and to speak with his superiors in his own language. However, from the first moment on, there were some limitations. In a way, in one regiment, a language group had to make up 20%. So if it was less than that, the language was not officially recognized. And it also had to be among the set of recognized languages. For example, there were a lot of languages which in the 19th century had been labeled to be only dialects. If we speak of Galicia, for example, Huzul, the Huzul language for a long time was used as being the same way like Ruthenian or Polish, but in the 19th century and also in the army, it was not a recognized language. How mixed had the regiments been? For example, in 1914, there were 142 regiments and independent battalions. They were monolingual, so using and recognizing only one language. And what is really interesting is that only 31 of them, so these who used only one language, for only 31 of them, German was the sole regiment language, which means like there had been a lot Austro-Hungarian or Kaunka regiments that were using solely Czech or solely Hungarian. There were 162 which recognized 2 languages, and there was also a couple which used 3 and 4 languages. Usually they were taken from Hungary, because there was less restrictions applied on which language and when to recognize for the Kingdom of Hungary. If we want to imagine how this worked during the war, I have brought a little comment from a novel or Memoirs, Mr. Pölzleitner. And he said about his own battalion in the First World War that he fought with 496 Germans, 137 Ruthenians, 73 Serbo-Croats, 70 Czechs, 45 Poles, 15 Italians, and 2 Romanians. So as you can see, what happened during the war is regiments and battalions, and especially the special forces like supply or so, they became more and more mixed because there was a shortage of men which grew over the years, which means as soon as someone recovered, for example, from an illness or from a wound, was sent back to the front and was simply put where he was needed. I said that the regimental language system said or that every soldier had the right to be trained in his native language and that he was allowed to use it towards his officers, which also implied that the officers had to know the language of their soldiers. But it was not solely, or it was not such a mixture, because very early on, the army command said, it's not going to work out properly in the case we also translate command words into all the languages. So German became the sole language of command. But in fact, although a lot of German nationalists pointed on the fact that it should be really German, there were a lot of words until the very end of the First World War that were from French origin. For example, ménage, which means the food supply, or parieren, exerzieren. So a lot of terms used as command language. What is command language? Command language was about a set of 80 terms or phrases. Every soldier, regardless of his native language, had to commemorate something like Luft, left, look, right, rechts schaut, links schaut. How did the army know about the language knowledge or the languages of the conscripts? So annually there was the medical examination and there was a personnel file set up for every soldier, which listed all the language knowledge. So this is really important. The army never asked for what's your nationality or what's your native or mother tongue. The army asked for all the language knowledge. So they were, of course, also interested in which languages someone spoke and not only in the nationality of a soldier. Why do I claim nationality? Because usually language use or mother tongue in Austro-Hungary were transformed or were interpreted in a way that it's to which nationality someone belongs. Nationality was the term used for that. So, for example, if someone's a German native speaker, he is a German. If someone is a Czech native speaker, he is a Czech. I've brought here 2 examples from one of these personnel files. It's called Grundbuchblätter or Matični listy. So most of them are still preserved in archives all over the former Habsburg monarchy. And I've brought one example from Lviv, now in Ukraine. And here you have most of these files from those serving between 1867 and 1914. Unfortunately, and this goes for all parts of the Habsburg monarchy, during the war, they were not that properly set up all the times any longer. The other one is an example from Prague, from the Vojenský historický archiv, where you can find Bohemians, Moravians, but also some from Austrian Silesia. But what is really interesting, so when they asked the soldiers during medical examinations, which languages do you speak? When they published the results annually in their statistical handbook, they did not portray them in a way like, look, we have this and that amount of German or Czech speakers or Ruthenian or Polish speakers or Slovak speakers, but we have a composition of nationalities. So they transformed that and portrayed it in public that these soldiers are of these nationality. What is also interesting, and I've brought one of these books, and if you're interested to do your own research in there, it's already digitized by Kramerius, which is set up from some Czech libraries, and they have digitalized a lot of material from Austro-Hungarian army times, handbooks, statistics, and so on. What's always interesting is that sometimes the army administration and bureaucracy contradicted themselves when it comes to their practice. So, for example, the language for Czech had to be used as language for Czech speakers, but very often you find in the sources the term Bohemian. So usually when they referred in the army to someone speaks Bohemian or someone is a Bohemian, they meant it synonymously for being a Czech. Here it's already shown that they use Czech, but they also use the term Moravians, Mährer, which did also don't make up a recognized regimental language, but they simply use these terms. Unfortunately, what is really painful sometimes for historians is that you find that in the archive, and then you're trying to find out in other documents, internal administrative documents, why did that happen? Why do they use the term Moravian? But this is sometimes you don't succeed, because there is a lot of material had already been destroyed before 1914 when it was given to the archives, for example. So unfortunately, very often you don't find the arguments why this and that term for language or nationality or an identity was used. I've said already that every recruit had the right to be trained in his native language, but this also implied that the army had enough training personnel available at all times, at all parts of the Habsburg monarchy, meaning the officers. It was usually the young officers, second lieutenants or cadets, who were responsible for the training of the soldiers. And there was also, when they started the conscription, that the promotion regulations for the officers changed. What does that mean? So from that moment on, 1867, 1868, the officers were required to learn the recognized languages in a battalion or regiment upon 3 years when they were transferred there. So what you can see is when you look closer on the CVs of these officers, that some really acquired a lot of language knowledge over the time. So when they then, for example, retired as colonel or even general, they usually spoke 4 to 5 languages. But there had also been a lot of officers who totally ignored this regulation. But I mean, it said like you're not promoted until you learn the language. But a lot of these officers managed to be transferred to another regiment without learning the language, and then maybe there they already knew the language, so they were promoted, or they were not promoted and then changed again. I found a lot of examples of officers who served 30 years in the army, trained soldiers, but never learned their languages. I mean, it's hard. Imagine that you're then a recruit from a village in Galicia and you want to express yourself and you have no option because the officer doesn't speak your language. This happened quite often. This was a mismanagement of the army language system, which was not solved until the First World War broke out. What the officers sometimes did was, like, and I've brought this as an example, is there was handbooks of how to learn, how to meet the requirement to be promoted. This was a phrase called zum Dienstgebrauch genügen, sufficient for service. And actually, although there were never standardized tests introduced, so it was usually up to the direct superior officer to decide if this officer knows the language enough or not. But usually what they did, they tried to at least commemorate the standard phrases provided in these language handbooks. And it's like, as you can see, I've brought an example from Polish, and it's clean my boots, or go and bring some food, or do this and that. So really standard phrases, but really interesting insight into what these authors expected, what officers have to do in their daily duty. What is really interesting, and I come to the First World War really shortly, is like there was two different kinds of political debate about the mismanagement of the language use in the army, and they were different between Austria and Hungary. Really briefly, in Austria and in the parliament in Austria, it was usually that Polish delegates from Galicia, delegates from Bohemia and Moravia brought up that the officers do not speak the language of their conscripts. And here is one example from Josef Kadlčák, who was a delegate from the Bohemian Catholic National Party from Moravia. And he said, that's not German and Czech what the officers speak to the conscripts. It's a really poor mixture of these two languages. And that the army should do something against this mismanagement and should more take care that the officers really know the language. What actually really often happened is like mixing up languages, so exactly what Kadlčák mentioned in the parliament and criticized. But on the other hand, and I always say, like, if you're a historian and you would only read the parliamentary session minutes or the press, you would come to the conclusion that all the conscripts hated the army because the officers did not speak the language properly. But actually, this mixing of languages, which all nationally thinking people criticized so much in public, finally became something like let's say like a corps d'esprit. So when former soldiers met, when they were 40, 50, wherever, they usually made fun of that. They said, like, you immediately after recognize if someone served in this Austro-Hungarian army because he is mixing languages, like using some Czech-sized German command words or some Polish phrases and so on. And the funniest song that ever came up I found during my research is this Kanonier Jaburek, a song that frequently comes up in autobiographical sources, that it was sung up until the First World War. And it's not Czech, it's not German, it's really a really funny mixture of these two languages. What is really interesting is that usually this funny mixture of languages that really become a strong point of identification for the soldiers. So it was not to be seen that bad before the war. What is really important is that all the mismanagement maybe caused debates in the parliaments or in the newspapers, but it did not threaten the survival of the people involved. During the First World War, when soldiers and officers were unable to communicate, this threatens operations and it threatens your survival. So it was a political issue before 1914. In peacetime, and this is almost my last slide on the times before 1914, it was more about sarcasm in the press, making fun. I've brought here a caricature from Simplicissimus, where two guys who are already a bit older, but they served in the army, and one asked the other, no Wenzel. So Wenzel is usually used to indicate that someone's a Czech. How did they command you when you served in the army, in German or in Bohemian? And as I said, he means Czech. And Wenzel answers, no, commands are in German, so that we learn it. But when they curse or when they talk bad with us, they usually use Czech so that we understand. So it was more a thing of sarcasm. And also during these famous Kaiser maneuvers, so where usually annually or every second year, there was really regiments coming to practice how to battle. It was more like a big event, but it was far away from what to expect then during the First World War. This is also something a lot of soldiers wrote in their diaries. Look, I've been to so many Kaiser maneuvers, but it's not comparable at all to how it was in the field. I've also brought this, what was used for training the soldiers, and this small, the Gloria of the Regiment handbook. And there were some handbooks, and most of them are in German, but there are some where the regiment or the people responsible there really tried hard to catch all languages of the conscripts. And for example, this is one of the few which is bilingual in German and in Czech. How does it now go on in summer 1914? And I've brought you an example because there had been thousands of expats of the Habsburg monarchy who now had been called up to enlist and to return home. And I know you know much better from the US, but I've brought an example from Luxembourg. In this one and the same issue of the Luxembourg word, the German army announced this call and the Austro-Hungarian. And while the German one was just one little box in one language, the Austro-Hungarian one covered 2 entire pages because it was written in 10 languages. And also famous Stefan Zweig in The World of Yesterday referred to these first days of the war in a way like the Babelish language confusion caused an additional hardship for all the soldiers of every imaginable nationality who had been thrown into this rolling coffin. However, what is really important, the autobiographical sources from the first weeks portray this mixture of languages more as a challenge to be mastered. So it does not refer to one language, like for example, the Czechs or Poles could behave disloyal or in a different way than maybe German speakers and Hungarians. It's more like a challenge. And I've brought an example from Anton Leha's Memoirs. And he recalls these days in Pressburg, so Bratislava today, many residents, as well as most of the soldiers from Wieselburg County, Western Hungary, spoke solely German. Members of the civil service, many craftsmen and people from the surrounding villages spoke solely Hungarian. Most of the older soldiers were Slovaks. Thus, communication among the officers, the NCOs, and the rank and file was difficult. I was partly fine, because I spoke Hungarian and also had some Slavic knowledge from my time in Prague. In my battalion, 1/3 of the officers spoke solely German, the rest Hungarian. Only a few were able to communicate in Slovak. What makes this really interesting is that for my last book, I've read hundreds of memoirs, diaries, and so on. And if you read so many of them, you can compare the wording. And it's really in the beginning of the first couple of months, it was just pointing on this challenge. Only later on, it became labeled, look, I suspect the Czechs behaving that way. I suspect Ruthenians behaving that way. So this on the way to the front story comes up in a lot of novels, and I can highly recommend everybody to read Josef Wittlin's Salt of the Earth. This is a typical novel with an autobiographical background. So Josef Wittlin was born in Austria and Galicia and died in New York, and he finished high school during the war and then enlisted voluntarily to be a reserve officer in 1916, together with his best friend Joseph Roth, also a very famous novelist. And so this is not like, it's packed into a novel, but you can really read through the lines that he experienced most of the stories that are covered on his own during his wartime service. And he also takes up this, like going to the front. Nastar, shout the booze-loving Czechs from the Magyar carriages as they pass by. Alien, shout the Czechs, transformed into Honveds. With the cries of Shivio, Ho, Nie, Hurra e Viva, Dai Bože Haras, the battalions of the multilingual monarchy greet each other as they march past. So it's really something like a challenge. And these mixture of languages, nationalities, but also religions, never forget that, it's just simply put as something they were confronted, something unknown. It's only a few came up with what these mixture of languages might cause when they are at the front. What is really important for Galicia, and of course I focused my article on Ruthenians, Poles, Slovaks and Czechs, so it's Galicia. Galicia from the first days of the First World War became a battlefield. So while Bohemia and Moravia throughout the war had been only home front, Galicia was changing front lines. Lots of the civilian population had to flee. Then it was occupied by Tsarist Russia. Then again, conquered back from Austro-Hungary and back and forth. And what happened is like there was these, from very early on, and you see this in diaries too, but also in the reports from the commanders sent to the Army High Command in Vienna, that there was some kind of hysteria that all Ruthenians are pro-Tsarist Russia and that they hate Austro-Hungary and that the civilian population does a lot against Austro-Hungary. So they're going to Russian troops, tell them about the strength of the Austro-Hungarian forces and so on and so on. What then happened is that a lot of Ruthenians were simply hanged or shot immediately right on the spot without any trial. Besides the violence, it's also something that a lot of officers who were from the western part of Austro-Hungary wrote something like, look, I'm an officer and no one in the army. So not in all of these years of army and officers training schools, no one learned me about all these different cultures of Austro-Hungary. So for a lot of them, and it's especially connected in Galicia with the church, a lot of them suspected. And Bruno Spitzel was a military chaplain from Salzburg, German-speaking Salzburg, Western Austria-Hungary. And he wrote, if at least the officers had known the religious and ethnological conditions of their own country, meaning usually it's Galicia and Bukovina, it would not have been possible to suspect every Greek Catholic church to be a Russian and to consider every Ruthenian priest in such a church most of whom legally married to be a Russian priest, and then in brackets usually and a spy. So for them, they had no idea how to distinguish between Russian Orthodox and Greek Catholic. That was one thing. So they did not know, they were unable to distinguish between the Ruthenian language and the Russian, and so on. The other thing is, and I'm always curious when I come across this, because lots of these soldiers did not know Ruthenian and Polish, lots of these Galicians did not know German, and I've come several times across that they then wrote, yeah, but then we spoke in English. Because also Oskar Dola wrote, Konstantin Schneider, included that into his memoirs. In conversation with the farmer in Galicia, I came upon the surprising fact that he spoke fluent English. He had, after all, worked for years in Canada. So what is really important is that a lot of these thousands of immigrants to the US, Canada, but also South America, Australia, they did not spend their entire life there. So very often they only worked for a couple of years and then they returned. Of course, lots of thousands also became citizens of these countries. But there is really thousands of people who returned to Austro-Hungary. I've also brought one example because exactly at the Eastern Front, there were lots of German imperial troops fighting together with Austro-Hungary. And for these, I'm always surprised because there was huge exchange between the military, the German military and the Austro-Hungarian one already in peacetime. So I'm always surprised reading memoirs of German officers from German Empire who do something like in the first days of summer 1914, oh, they don't all speak German? What's going on here? So this is also a frequent motive which comes up. It's like with Gerhard Wellburg, who served in Romania and then wrote, they handed over to me these three guys to build a new communication line. The first is a Bosniak, the second a Czech, and the third a Hungarian. None of them speak German. Moreover, they're even unable to communicate with one another. And this is also something that frequently came up, not only in German diaries and memoirs. Another novel with an autobiographical touch, like Wittlin's Salt of the Earth, is Friedrich Heidenau, Lieutenant Lugger. And he also comes up with a lot of images how fighting was, especially from a German-speaking officer's point of view, with Ruthenians, Czechs, and so on. I can highly recommend if you're interested, because on the top of this slide there is a piece of one little piece of his personnel file, and these so-called Qualifikationslisten are for 2 years now available online via familysearch.org. So if you like, you can screen through the officers on your own. And he wrote, the two reserve lieutenants march in silence. Here's a teacher of German at a provincial secondary school. Well, he twirls his thin goatee, and in sing-song Ruthenian German, why shouldn't I? What does it tell us? So with the First World War, thousands of so-called reserve officers were enlisted and usually fought at the spot because they were direct front line, because they were second lieutenants usually. And these reserve officers came from all nationalities. And he refers to, I think, from a nationality, a Ruthenian, a teacher, who, because reserve officers, when you graduated from high school, you had been asked if you want to serve for 2 or 3 years among ordinary people, or serve for 1 year and become a reserve officer. And so a lot of them opted for the reserve officer position. And so you find a lot of Ruthenians who had been reserve officers during the First World War. And Mr. Lugger, or Oppenheimer, actually, he served he served in a Ruthenian or a regiment from Galicia during the First World War. And he also comes up with like the second theme, then dispatch riders drop by. They belong to a literal regiment. The Poles and Ruthenians do not understand their Italian. They only catch the word commando and repeat it backwards in German. Sushkin shines his light into the first chapter. So as you can see, soon they all mixed up and were unable to communicate to one another. What often happened is like that they were sent to the wrong direction, which means like they were caught and sent to Siberia in prisoners of war camps, or they were shot by their own people. So so-called friendly fire happened very often in the First World War for Austro-Hungarian soldiers because they were unable to properly or at all communicate. And the third thing why I chose Lieutenant Luga is empty. Shame and bitterness fell him. Soldiers of his company, his recruits, his compatriots. The entire platoon consisted of Ruthenians, not a single Pole among them. His cheeks glow, Ruthenians. He himself is a Ruthenian, and there is no one more loyal to the emperor. God heavens. Of course, there is always some kind of truth before it becomes a myth and before it becomes a hysteria. So there had been some Ruthenians who went over to the Russian troops, and there had been some who were spying for Russia. It became a hysteria, so that after a while, most people suspected per se that all Ruthenians are against Austro-Hungary. And so while they may be for the same, I don't know, like up a church and then waving to someone, you know, in the next village, if a Ruthenian did that in Galicia during the First World War, there was a high chance that for that he was shot immediately because they suspected him of being a spy. Well, when, for example, a Hungarian did the same, they said like, yeah, it's just his girlfriend living there. So it really became a hysteria, and hundreds of Ruthenians from the civilian population were executed. It did not only happen to Ruthenians, but also to Czechs. Especially after the so-called betrayal of the 28th Infantry Regiments, where more than one battalion actually surrendered to the Russian troops and went into captivity. There is new research now on this, but during the First World War, it was portrayed all over the Habsburg monarchy in all newspapers, like as the betrayal of the Czechs, don't trust the Czech, they were all against Austro-Hungary. And this theme was taken up by generations of historians. Only in recent years, there is new studies about which say, like, look, they were so desperate at this front line. They had nothing to eat for about 2 weeks. They were tired, and so they surrendered. So it was not because they said, like, yeah, we're all against Austro-Hungary and we want to support Russia. So it was, of course, it was a mixture. There were also some people who wanted to have a Czech nation state, but it was not all of them who surrendered. But what actually happened is that this regiment was dismantled. So Emperor Francis Joseph said, like, okay, it no longer exists. And the remaining troops from these regiments were mixed with others at other front lines, which again caused the problem that now a lot of Czechs had to serve among Bosniaks or Hungarians or German speakers, and again found themselves being unable to talk to anyone. Military physicians and prejudices. I also want to come up with these military positions which are often overlooked, because very often diaries are written by frontline officers or high generals who are sitting comfortable in the rear. But there is two groups who actually are close, especially to the front line, to the dying, and that's the physicians and the military chaplains. And there's a couple of memoirs, diaries too. I've brought here one from a military physician, and he was serving in a division where there were a lot of Ruthenians and Poles. And he wrote or remembered, Hartstein used a Ruthenian who had been wounded by shrapnel some time ago and spoke to him in Polish. Why Polish, I asked. Don't you speak Ruthenian too? I have to speak Polish with the people, otherwise they won't respect me. So this also brings up another topic that was very often part of the discussion during the First World War. It's portrayed in a way the German-speaking elite and the speakers in the Habsburg monarchy, you know, they were on the top looking down on us. But actually what also made the situation worse is there was also problems and quarrels between nationalities. So, for example, Slovene speakers and Italian speakers in Trieste and around Trieste. So it was not about we hate the German speakers dominating Vienna. It was a local struggle which they brought to the front lines. And the same happened with Ruthenian and Polish speakers from Galicia. So there was always some kind of struggle between them apparent. And you also find this in the autobiographical documents. there were nationalities under growing suspicion, and what it turned into a way like they still had the right to use their language towards their superiors, among each other, to sing songs for motivation while marching to the front. So the language rights from before 1914 did not change during the war. But what did change was the reaction of some and how they were labeled. So some Czech songs became labeled to be disloyal per se, like Te domov můj, which is today the national anthem. It was sang before 1914 all the time. It was sang in summer 1914 when they first went to the front as a motivation song, as a patriotic song. But after a while became a disloyal and nationalistic. But it also happened, and I've brought an example for a mass from now Italian front, because what is really important, Ruthenians, Poles, Slovaks, and Czechs served at all fronts. And I've mostly now brought examples from the Eastern Front. This example is from Memoirs of a train officer. It seems it happened in Tyrol in Brixen, so today South Tyrol. A Czech military chaplain held Sunday service for his regiment, which was passing through with a sermon in Czech. No sooner had he begun speaking Czech than several artillery officers who otherwise attended church regularly demonstratively stood up and left the church. It may be that this was intended as a protest against the actions of the 28th Infantry Regiment, but in any case, it was very ill-advised. I saw this all the more clearly from the fact that after the Mass, the military chaplain himself sang the imperial anthem in Czech, and the whole regiment sang along with great enthusiasm. It is completely untrue that the Czech nation as a whole was treasonous. So what is really important is, if this would have happened before 1914, that there is a Mass, and they sang or they speak in Czech, the Mass is in Czech, the prayers are in Czech, the songs are in Czech, and some officers leave the church because they don't want to have Czech there, they might have lost their officer status, because officers were requested not to be national, treat all nationalities the same way. But during the First World War, when Czechs had been in the official discourse already labeled to be treasonous, traitors, then this happened, and nothing happened. But it, of course, you can imagine how these soldiers felt who were attending the Mass, singing the Magdeburg anthem, and then these officers left the church. I mean, at some time, all these Czech soldiers felt like, so maybe they don't like us. So is there a future for us in this monarchy? And I can highly recommend to read Jiří Hudečka's book about masculinity and the Czech soldiers in the First World War, because he deals a lot with that. So what it makes with people when they are treated that bad. What's also important is, what about censorship? I mean, from one day to another, there was censorship, and thousands and millions of letters were sent every day from home to front and the other way. So they were unable to read and censor all of them, to provide enough people everywhere to be able to read all these languages the letters are written in. And so they immediately after invented this so-called I'm fine, I'm healthy card, so it was not allowed to write anything else on that, but it passed through without censorship. Pastoral care is also really important. So what did priests do when someone died? And you need to listen and understand the last confession. From one day to another, also the Roman Catholic Church moved in a way like, okay, you're allowed, in the end, they even allowed that you can use a translator, an interpreter, if you need help to speak to a dying person and listen to the last confession. But they also published something like Confessarus Polyglottus. So this was a little booklet with the same sentences in all the languages, where you were able, even if you don't understand the language, to hear the last confession. What's really important is that it was especially with the Roman Catholic Church, where most nationalities had some Roman Catholics among them, to provide enough priests. And it really happened after a while that there was one priest or one clergyman. So not priest, a clergyman. Is it a Protestant, a Roman Catholic, a Greek Catholic, or an imam, a Muslim imam, or a Jewish rabbi who was responsible for hundreds of soldiers, regardless of the confession. So Already before 1914, the military clergy had the duty, even if the dying soldier does not have the same confession, that they have to support him and give him a warm feeling, remind him of his life, and so on. So they really did during the First World War. So regardless of their religion, they took care of the dying. A lot of military chaplains died during the First World War because they were directly at the front. And so this shortage of military clergy became harder and harder. And also there was the suspicion towards some nationalities also hit the military clergy. And I've brought this example that says, the field chaplain of Infantry Regiment 13, a Jesuit, famously said, "I'm first a priest, then a Pole, and only then an Austrian." As a result, he was sent home by the division. I mean, imagine again, what does that mean? For the soldiers he left behind, he should do pastoral care. So he was simply sent back home for that and left behind hundreds of soldiers who might be religious, who would have felt better if they have a priest around them, but he was, out of national reasons, suspicion, sent home. The war's end and the retreat created new myths. One is, and I've brought this example again from Josef Lepp, because he's one of these who are writing throughout the war, and it's hundreds of pages, and it's really covering almost every day of the war. And we are back to Tyrol and the front against Italy in October 1918. A few days before 1st November, the order came to organize the soldiers into groups according to nationality. I obeyed this order like any other and did not experience any disruption to my department as a result. The representative I appointed for the Czech was a committed social democrat, yet he maintained discipline until the very last moment. The same was true of the Croats and Serbs. I was deeply saddened that 12 Upper Austrian farmers, led by a corporal, left my unit during the night. That was a gross act of ingratitude. So what is really important, and we all have that in mind, which kind of myth started within the new republics after the end of the First World War and the dissolution of the monarchy, that the Czechs were always against. They always want to go home. They never wanted to obey the orders of the Austro-Hungarian army. But also the same goes for soldiers of Croat and Serbian nationality. And this is also which was created by the Austrian state after, but the German speakers, the Austrians of German nationality, they were so loyal all the time. They already did that before 1914 in a way, like we are the only ones the emperor can rely upon. But if you really dig deep and read minutes of diaries from these days or memoirs, you see that it wasn't that black and white. So it really depended on the commander, it depended on the front line, it depended on if the soldiers had enough to eat, if these Czech speakers were still treated in a friendly way, were not suspected all the time of being against Austro-Hungary, so that they simply did their job till the very end, and a lot of them did. But Upper Austrians, so in 1918 words of German nationality, did not. Often forgotten is language diversity and commemoration. I mean, of course, who takes care today of military cemeteries, or those who set them up after the First World War, were not the state structures for which these soldiers fought and died. But I always like to draw attention on them too. So what is written on these military cemeteries when there is information given, which language is used on the graves. And I've been 3 years ago going through the Golice Tarnów battle region, where you have really a lot of thousands of soldiers died there. And you have a lot of different kinds of military cemeteries. And what I usually criticize is that the information is usually given in German and in the language of the country where the military cemetery is situated. But this is not at all sufficient, because if people don't know about the Austro-Hungarian army and they see this like on the screen, they think like, okay, it's a Polish and German soldiers here, or just German or Austrians, and it's in Polish because we're in Poland. And then you go and see the graves and you see like Franz Havranek. I mean, Havranek can also be a Viennese person, because a lot of Czechs lived before 1918 in Vienna. but all the first names are usually given in German, which also indicates in a way, is this really a Czech? So they do not appear in this diversity as the soldiers have been. And I would wish for that in 2025, we might be able to, fix this, or at least give a QR code which indicates in the languages of these soldiers who they had been and what was going on this place. I would wish for that. I want to finalize my lecture with a project we are currently working on, and maybe you can support us with some information. A while ago, I have found a place where 450 Austro-Hungarian soldiers are buried. It's in a crypt under a church in Rome. Before I started the project, there were 450, 300 were tagged with unidentified, which meant they never informed the families about what happened to them. We now have managed to identify a lot of them. We were also already in contact with some descendants, but we have all the name lists, we have everything online. So maybe you find one of your descendants, lost great grand, whatever. We would be very pleased. And it's really a place where actually the biggest number of soldiers which are buried in this crypt is about 90 to 100 came from Galicia. So most of them had been Ruthenians and Poles, but also Jews from Galicia. And actually there is a lot of Czechs too. And I have my Czech colleague Jiří Hudečka, who is responsible for the Czechs who are buried in the crypt. And we are trying to set up a book of commemoration in the church, but also online. The more we work on that, the more biographies of the soldiers we portray. Last but not least, there is also a lot to be found in the countries where they had been in captivity. This is an example from Velletri, which is close to Rome. Thank you very much for your attention, and only as a last slide, some hints. I really hope you are now or still interested in this topic, and my last book is also available only online in English and open access. I've also done a bit about what about the experts, and these ones returning and speaking English only and fought in the First World War. There is also a little lecture video on my YouTube channel about Ktedomov Muj and Bacht am Rhein. So how songs were labeled to be disloyal or extremely loyal during the First World War. And feel free, if you like these topics I was presenting, to join me on social media. Thank you very much from Vienna.